How is the world's wealth shared? Now hold your breath. 0.07% of the population owns 41% of global assets. And 68% of the population owns 3% of global assets. That is the gap between the rich and the poor, globally speaking. 68% of the world, say 70% of the world, owns 3% of global assets. And 41%, close to half of global wealth, is owned by 0.7%. Now, if that does not shock you, this should shock you, which is that the 62 richest people in the world are worth more than the 50% of the world. 50%, 62 people have more wealth than 3.5 billion people. And that is a cartoon which is seriously not funny. We come to the issue of women's rights. Women's rights not as described by having a piece of cloth on the head, but as described by something very fundamental, which is how much do you pay a woman for the same work as you pay a man. I mean, that's a fair comparison. If you pay a man X amount of money for a particular job, if a woman does exactly the same job, how much do you pay her? And we pay her 20% less. These are figures for the United States of America as on 2015. The figures for Europe are the same. Women to this day are getting 20% less for the same work. And that's why there's an organization which says, stop discounting women, I'm not worth less. So, that's one hand. We need to change the definition. We need to redefine the problem from their problem to our problem. And I'm not saying this that you should do this out of the goodness of your heart. It is our problem. It is our problem. I seriously suggest, do not wait for that problem to come knocking at your door before you do something about it. Because that will be decidedly tragic. There's a guy in Madurai called Narayanan Krishnan who was a chef, and he gave up his job and set up a kitchen to feed the mentally ill. We like to talk about ikhlas. Here is a man who is feeding people who do not even know he exists. They can't even thank him because they don't know what's happening to them. And he goes and feeds them by hand, literally, in some cases. Now he says that his mother, obviously his parents were very upset that he gave up this, nice job in this hotel and so on, and he trained to become a chef. We don't just become a chef like that, so all his training and everything else. So he said to his mother, he said, you come with me one day. And then if you tell me to give up this job, I'll give it up. So his mother said, okay, came with him. And he said, at the end of the day, my mother fed some people by hand, and she said to him, I will support you as long as I am alive. You do this work. Why am I saying this to you? Because to prove to you that the problems I mentioned to you are not global problems that need global solutions. They are global problems that need local solutions. And who is local? I am local. You are local. You are local. Each of us can and should make a difference, as I said, to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and very clearly in our own self-interest. Pick whichever one you want. I was looking for a Muslim name. Mercifully I found one. And this is Dabirpura flyover. Chap called Azhar Maqsusi, who's doing not exactly the same thing, but alhamdulillah also feeding poor people. So go support him. Give him money, help him to do that. And I seriously suggest you go and actually feed people. Unless you do these things with your own hand, you do not realize the impact of it doesn't actually hit us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us enough that we live in cocoons. We live in cocoons. Our entire climate is controlled not only by air conditioning but by all kinds of other shields that we have put around ourselves. So we do not actually come into contact with the reality of this life. Alhamdulillah, may Allah continue to keep you in that cocoon and keep you safe. But that doesn't mean the reality is not there, and it also doesn't mean that this cocoon is impervious and cannot be broken. Third story, many of you probably are familiar with this. A man called Dashrath Manji in Bihar. He lived in the village. His wife got sick. To take her to the hospital, he had to go around 19 kilometers around a huge, a big mountain which is next to his village. By the time he reached the road to catch a bus, by the time he got his wife to the hospital, she died. And the only reason she died, Wallahu alam, of course, she died because it was the time to die, but this journey of 19 kilometers to the bus station, she died. So what does he do? He decides to cut the mountain and drive a road directly from his village to the main road of the bus stand. So what does the man do? He is a stone cutter. What does he do? He takes his chisel, he takes his hammer, and he cuts a mountain. It took him 22 years, and he cut the mountain straight through. No survey equipment, no satellite photographs, no nothing. He just cut the mountain through, and he just didn't make a hole. He made a huge big road through this mountain, single-handedly working for 22 years. He says people of the village came, they said, "You are mad, you are crazy." They said he's gone mad because of the grief of his wife's death, and so on and so on. The man didn't talk to anyone, he just kept cutting the mountain. 22 years later, there is a road in the mountain, and people do not have to go for 19 kilometers to get to the hospital. Why am I telling you this? Because if that man can do it, you can do it, I can do it. My brothers and sisters, we own the world. Rejoice, because therefore the responsibility is ours. 1 billion people go to bed hungry. What kind of a world? 2.8 billion are short of clean water. 2.3 billion are without sanitation. And therefore I am saying that it is our responsibility to change the situation because we have the means. So what is social responsibility? Is it progress? We like to look at our world and we like to look at this country, for example. We say we are a great progressing nation. Is it progress when 75% of the population does not have food and water? Why is it necessary? We had a big hue and cry because the government said schools must necessarily educate poor children. Big hue and cry. People put cases in the Supreme Court against this legislation of the government. Isn't it absolutely shameful? Absolutely pathetically shameful. What you should do on your own, the government has to put a legislation and then you fight the legislation. Because your schools are being run to make money, not for the education or the alleviation of poverty or any of that. I submit to you that growth for the sake of growth is the philosophy of the cancer cell. And that's why there's a wonderful documentary that you must see called Four Horsemen. Many of you have seen it. It's worth seeing several times, as a matter of fact, and you will see the YouTube link is there. It will come with you. It will come to you on when you get this presentation. Wonderful quote in that from Frederick Bastiat, who says, when plunder becomes a way of life for a group of people living together in society, they create for themselves in the course of time a legal system that authorizes it and a moral code that glorifies it. And in a minute I will explain to you. Now, people remember us not by what we consumed, but by what we contributed. Make no mistake, if I asked you just now to tell me what your own parents and grandparents owned, I can bet you don't even know. Why do you think that anyone is going to remember what you owned or they care whatever you. Why would they care what you owed? People remember us by what we contributed, not by what we consume. So big question, how do you define achievement? We say the topic of this talk is qualities of top achievers. So what is achievement? So I suggest that you think about that. Now let's look at 3 top achievers in this world. According to me, in my estimation, how do you define achievement? You define achievement by its impact. What was the impact of that particular achiever in the world? What was the impact? How long did the impact last? So let me start with one of my ancestors, Genghis Khan. Lived for about 65 years. First almost 20 years of his life he lived as a fugitive, running for his life. In the next 40 years he created the largest empire that mankind has ever known on the face of this planet. At its peak, Genghis Khan's empire was over 12.7 million square miles. Say 13 million square miles. All the way from all of China to all of Asia to half of Europe. Ruled by one man. His biography is definitely worth reading. It's been written by a man called John Mann, and it's a wonderful study of how he built this empire. Absolutely amazing. Very, very simple principles that he used, and I will share all that with you, inshallah, in a minute. So, 13 million square miles. Just to put things in perspective, the entire area of India as a country is 1.2 million square miles. 1/10 of this empire. So those of you who think that the Mughal emperors and Akbar and so on were great kings and had a great empire, they never ruled the whole of India. So they ruled a part of 1.2 million square miles, whereas Genghis Khan ruled 13 million square miles. To put things into perspective, Alexander the Great, his empire was 2 million square miles. Genghis Khan, 13 million square miles. The Roman Empire was less than Alexander's, 1.7 million square miles. The Umayyad Khilafah, the Muslim Empire, which was the biggest empire of Muslims in terms of of empires, was 5.8 million square miles. Genghis Khan's empire was 13 million square miles. Genghis Khan's empire was 2.5 times the Muslim empire at its peak, Banu Umayyah. Banu Umayyah at its peak, I am saying, when the Abbasids came to power, this was much smaller during the time of Sayyidina Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu, and so on and so forth. So this is at that peak time. Now, how did he do that? What are the leadership principles of Genghis Khan? Number 1 is strict meritocracy without exception. He had a beautiful system, which was, you would call it a decimal system, for example. He had a wonderful system of how the armies were, how he built his army. Every 10 soldiers elected a leader, and that leader commanded 10 soldiers. A group of this 10, which means 100 soldiers, elected a leader, and that leader commanded those 100. A group of 10 of those hundreds, which is 1,000 soldiers, elected a leader, and he was a commander of 1,000. And a group of 10, which means 10,000 soldiers, elected a leader, and that leader commanded the 10,000. Very simple. Now the beauty of this was that no leaders were imposed on anybody. People elected their own leader. So if you wanted to be elected, you had to be somebody who people respected, which means you had to look after your troops. Otherwise they won't elect you. So automatically the troops respected their commanders, and he had this beautifully, fantastically knit army. It's completely strict meritocracy. Genghis Khan had a commander-in-chief called Subadai, and Subadai was an ordinary soldier in the army of Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan spotted him, trained him, he rose to become the commander-in-chief, and all 4 sons of Genghis Khan were under the command of Subadai. His elder son rebelled against him, and when he let me come to that in the end. So we'll talk about that. But basically, strict meritocracy without exception. No special treatment for the Khan's children or this or that. Nothing.